By the end of the Cretaceous period, a chunk of time that lasted from around 145 to 66 million years ago, plenty of dinosaur lineages had gone extinct. The general biodiversity of dinosaurs and other weird critters they lived with had been shaken up many times. The hadrosaurs were the most common large-bodied herbivorous animals across much of the world. Titanosaurian sauropods were the only things bigger, but were much more common in the southern hemisphere. The ceratopsians, or horned dinosaurs, were also among the most diverse and common animals worldwide throughout the Cretaceous period. Their near ubiquity means that learning more about them also means learning more about the changes to biodiversity of terrestrial ecosystems over time, and how stable certain ecologies were over deep time, leading up to the space rock impact. Despite the high diversity of horned heads and their strong fossil record, many things remain elusive about them. For example, most are told apart by the features of their heads, not their bodies. The significance of the differences in the bodies of ceratopsians remains largely overlooked. Ontogeny is another spot in ceratopsian research that needs some light shed on it. Ontogeny is the study of how organisms grow and change throughout their lives. It's especially important to keep ontogenesis, or the development of organisms, in mind when dealing with fossil animals. Mostly only fossils remain, and they are never complete. So, having some idea of how any lineage changed as it aged is paramount to getting better at knowing how many dinosaurs were around at any given point in time. Despite being quite common animals, ceratopsians don't have many examples of ontogenesis. There are now over a handful of young specimens of the advanced horned heads, centrosaurs like Centrosaurus, Styracosaurus, and Pachyrhinosaurus, as well as chasmosaurs like Chasmosaurus, Gorilla-ceratops, and Triceratops. Many more examples exist among the early ceratopsians like Protoceratops and Psittacosaurus. So, any new juvenile to subadult ceratopsian specimens will help continue to shrink the parameters used to identify new animals and outline animal growth. One such specimen was discovered over 20 years ago that not only provides new, younger remains, but complicates an old misconception and adds more data to a small, new group of ceratopsians that seems hell-bent on growing. A dinosaur skeleton was discovered on private Montanan land in 2012 within the Upper Cretaceous-aged Coal Ridge member of the Judith River Formation in Fergus County, Montana, 7 kilometers northwest of the town of Winifred. Paleontologists with Tribald Paleontology Inc., a company involved with fossil finding, excavating, preparing, and museum fabrication, went out there and painstakingly uncovered the fossil remains, field prepared them, jacketed them, and brought them back to the Rocky Mountain Dinosaur Resource Center in Woodland Park, Colorado for further preparation. Museum curator and Zephactinus hater Anthony Maltese extensively documented the work as he and his team continued to find more and more of the skeleton. This makes this dinosaur a special case where I can show you how real paleontology is done. As they worked, they found that the site, which they had numbered 12020, or just called the Ava site, had many more bones than initially thought. According to Maltese's words on his RMDRC blog, he and his team initially thought that what they had on their hands was an Avaceratops, a very rare ceratopsian from the Judith River Formation, a chunk of rock that dates to between 79 to 75.3 million years ago, found exclusively in Montana. These fossils were encased in very hard sandstones, so Maltese and company first did all they could with hand tools before returning to the site with bigger and nastier equipment. According to Maltese, the site, which started out as a small hand-dug pit at the bottom of a wash, ended up as a hole the size of a decent basement. Bobcat excavators, jackhammers, and air tools, complete with 2 compressors running, made for a noisy and gritty dig site, but the work paid off. From what I have read of Maltese's old posts, it seems that the entire dinosaur excavation lasted until late 2013. Field work is obviously physically taxing and often takes quite a long time due to weather, seasons, and money. However, once everything has been fully excavated and brought to the museum or repository, the next chunk of work is just as taxing, though perhaps less physically demanding. But maybe we can equate 200 hours of sitting at a table air scribing rock from delicate fossils. After all, that stuff kills your back and vibrates your soul. Maltese referred to all of the dinosaurs' bones as being jackstrawed. This essentially means that all of the bones are jumbled in a heap over top of one another. That made preparing the bones especially difficult because the preparators had to carefully clean one bone at a time and carefully remove each one from the plaster jacket so they didn't crumble to dust. In fossil preparation, there are a bunch of tools of the trade. At the most basic mechanical level, there are the hard hand tools, like picks, knives, shovels, scrapers, and such. These are small tools usually used for sculpting clay or by dentists for whatever eldritch procedures they conduct. There are also tools made specifically by fossil prep companies for the purpose of fossil preparation, so that you have tools with slightly better shapes to them for picking off bits of rock matrix from fossils, but so long as it works, it works. From there, you have the power tools, like air scribes, chisels, and abrasives. Air scribes are basically air-powered mini chisels or scribes. It pushes the metal rod in and out at high speeds so you can more powerfully chip rocks from the fossil. Air abrasives are handheld air blasters that shoot out tiny particles to blast rock off fossils. The particles can be all sorts of things, such as sodium bicarbonate, dolomite, iron powder, and aluminum oxide. These sorts of tools are usually used to finish fossils. They go easier on fossil surfaces and are great for revealing minute details. When preparing the ceratopsian remains, Maltese and the RMDRC team used air scribes to pick off the harder sandstone matrix surrounding the bones, and then used the softer air abrasives to clean rock off of more delicate parts of the bones. Once the bones were removed from the rock, Maltese and company filled in cracks and replaced missing pieces with epoxy putty. This was done so they could more easily mold the fossils to create casts. Tribal Paleo Inc. is a casting company too, after all. Many museums that don't do any commercial molding and casting also use this technique. They will often make sure that the putty they use to fill in cracks or replace missing pieces is of a completely different color to the fossil, so that it is extremely obvious which part is which. Unfortunately for many modern museum workers, historically workers would try to replicate the color of the fossil with putty and paint so that they had a more aesthetically pleasing item to put out for exhibition. So, many workers are now going back to old specimens, removing the fake stuff, re-preparing the real fossil, and sometimes adding in better materials that are more obviously not fossil. The same goes for all those old glues that would permanently stick fossils together or stain them. Nasty stuff. The next step for the Rocky Mountain Dinosaur Resource Center team was to scan all the bones they got from their new horned dinosaur. One reason to do this is so that they can mess around with the fossils without permanently breaking the actual fossils. Another reason is so they could mirror the fossils that they had that would have had counterparts in the skeleton, such as jaws, toes, or ribs. Completely missing bones with no symmetrical partner would have to be modeled in the computer using the bones of close relatives and inferences made using the bones they did find. For example, some missing vertebrae can be modeled based on the size and shape of the vertebrae before and after it that were preserved in the specimen. Once this is done, the RMDRC can 3D print all the bones in resin and plastic filament and start piecing them together, cutting up pieces that were originally smooshed through the process of fossilization and then gluing them in different positions and even adding in more clay to smooth things out was how they could get something resembling a full reconstruction of the animal. This is how the scientists went from these unassuming shelves of bone to this prototype resin skull without pulling anything out of where the sun don't shine. Anthony Maltese states, "Our frontals were squished just enough in the ground that when the brow horns were attached to the mount, the tips crossed each other. That's probably not how they went in life. The casts were then adhered together into sub-assemblies ready for molding." The crew had a fully reconstructed cast skull of this animal ready for presentation at the 2014 meeting of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology. The full skeleton would not be completely prepared, reconstructed, molded, and cast until late 2015. This is when we got this lovely image of Maltese presenting us with his horny atrocity. At some point in time between the 2015 news release of the newly minted Avaceratops skeletal mount and 2023, the fossils were acquired by the National Museum of Nature and Science in Tokyo, Japan. It's a good thing it ended up in a museum because sometimes they don't, and are instead sold at auctions at exorbitant prices. That being said, it is usually always the goal of most commercial outfits to get these specimens into the hands of museums and researchers so they don't become lost in the mansions of billionaires. Now that I have outlined the precise details of this critter's discovery and excavation, why don't we do a quick run-through of the nerdier details? So, all told, the holotype specimen NSM-PV24660, contained most of the spinal column from the neck, back, pelvis, and tail. It also preserves both femori, the majority of the left lower leg, the left shoulder blade, the majority of both forelimbs, a huge swath of torso and neck ribs, tail ribs, and most of the noggin, only missing most of the front of the nose, the middle of the frill, and some smaller parts of the side of the skull. Absent from many articles and even the main publication is mention of the preservation of skin impressions on the animal's hip. Anthony Maltese wrote about this on his blog. A small patch of skin impressions was found on the hip and gently prepared with hand tools. It's not the best skin impression, but the details that can be made out align rather well with known skin impressions from Triceratops. Overall, a very impressive specimen. The specimen finally got its due in a 2023 publication by paleontologist Hiroyuki Ishikawa, Takanobu Tsuhiji, and Makoto Manabe in the journal Cretaceous Research. They named the mysterious horned dinosaur Ceratops elucidens. The genus name is made up of Cercatus, Latin for fork-like in reference to the shape of the brow horns, and Ceratops, Latin for horned face, while the species name elucidens is Latin for elucidate, in reference to the new information provided by the specimen. Speaking of which, what is that information and why is it important? Ceratops was not fully grown when it died. It wasn't a juvenile, but it still had a ways to go. The Tribald Paleo Inc. folks were able to determine that the animal wasn't fully grown due to many unfused bones, a characteristic feature of immaturity. The Japanese team further proved the animal a subadult because the texture of the surface of the skull bones aligns with what is seen in known immature ceratopsians and living birds. The textures and structures at the end of the long bones also characterize an immature animal. Next up, the team did histologic analyses on the skeleton. That is the act of slicing up the bone into super thin wafers, adhering them to a microscope slide, polishing the fossil side of that slide until it meets a set thickness, preparing the slide with epoxies, and observing the microscopic anatomy of the bone under the microscope and with different types of light. This process can show you cancers, age, parasites, and much more. The histologic samples of Ceratops showed the animal was still growing when it died. Ceratops is also important because it preserves a lot of the skeleton. It preserves parts of the skeleton often missing in other ceratopsians, such as the lower jaw and the small bones connecting it to the skull. The animal's body is also largely intact, which helps to understand other ceratopsians' bodies better. Most past studies have not dealt much with the bodies of ceratopsians, assuming they are all the same. So, the body of Ceratops will be used in the future as a point of reference. Speaking of which, what the hell even was Ceratops? Once the researchers tallied up all of the traits of Ceratops that were unique to it and those found in other ceratopsian dinosaurs and put all that data into the phylogenetic software of their choice, they found that Ceratops was the closest relative to the bull-horned Nasutoceratops as part of the Nasutoceratopsinae tribe, along with a Museum of the Rockies possible Avaceratops and the holotype of the one and only Avaceratops. This is controversial because Ceratops was placed very close to Avaceratops for many years, Sometimes researchers have even believed Cretaceous to be a new species of Avaceratops, or an individual of a known Avaceratops species. The problem is that the holotype specimen of Avaceratops is a juvenile, making identifying anything else as an Avaceratops a very difficult job. In other words, it's bad data. Another specimen, MOR 692, has been associated with Avaceratops. This specimen is of a much older individual centrosaur from the same time as Avaceratops. It has even been lumped into the Avaceratops genus in the past. However, it shares more with the Cretaceous specimen than the dubious juvenile Avaceratops holotype. A third centrosaur, CMN 8804, has also been pulled into the conversation. This guy is from the Old Man Formation and shares some similarities with Cretaceous, but the author team decided not to try making a full comparison due to how fragmentary CMN 8804 is. Therefore, this leaves Nasutoceratops as the most complete closest relative to Cretaceous. Even if the others may be slightly more related, you just cannot tell due to how bad the data in those other specimens are. Before we move on to the biology and ecology of this unique dinosaur, let's bring in
Mr. Man from Animal Planet's The Most Extreme
to get a general estimate of how big this critter was when it was running around. A very good estimate of the animal's size can be attained thanks to the nearly complete skeleton. It stood at approximately 1.2 meters, 3.9 feet, and was 3.5 meters or 11.48 feet long. Quite a small dinosaur, but still not the smallest of the horned dinosaurs. Plus, the wee beast had some growing yet to do. Thanks, Mr. Man. As you can see, Cretaceous had a really weird schnoz. The original skull is missing the bulbous outer part of the snout, only preserving the back and the tip of the beak, the premaxillae. The rest of the face has been filled in with information from Nasutoceratops, which had a big inflated snout. Look at the size of the bony nose hole puncturing the snout. Lots of fleshy stuff would have filled that cavity when the animal snorted and hollered. Still, to what extent is unknown. Some researchers hypothesize that the giant nostrils would have housed giant natural AC and humidifiers for the air they breathed. Another hypothesis is that these animals had giant soft tissue displays in there and blew up their noses like balloons to communicate quickly. One of the better preserved aspects of this animal are the horns and frill. The horns' peculiar shape and orientation gave the animal its name. They curved up and over the snout and slightly bent towards one another. It was noted that the original orientation of the specimen's horns had them overlapping one another. However, this was due to the fossilization process warping the bones after they turned to minerals. The frill was quite small compared to later ceratopsians, though not entirely unusual for Nasutoceratopsians, centrosaurs, or the much earlier ceratopsians like Zuniceratops and Tyrannoceratops. Sexual selection would only inflate the frills of the giant chasmosaurs. Cretaceous had some fun, fat little hornlets bordering the frill. They all bent out in funny little directions, giving it a haphazard look. Cretaceous had long, skinny limbs for bounding away from predators and a moderate-length tail for balancing itself as it did so. Perhaps this is a feature of its age, and Cretaceous would gain the proportions seen in Nasutoceratops. Only an adult specimen would provide an answer. Now that we have such a good image of the animal, what images can we conjure of its environment? Early on in the Tribold crew's excavation of the Ava site, Anthony Maltese had interpreted it as a prehistoric logjam of logs, sticks, and dead bodies. As Maltese writes on his blog, after the dinosaur died, its partially mummified body washed down a stream channel until it hit a logjam composed of not only actual logs, but the limb bones of a large hadrosaur. Here it lodged upside down and then began to partially disarticulate. A few tyrannosaur teeth were found at the site, but we feel those were incidental background fossils, as no predation or scavenging marks were observed on the bones. Those few extra bones found littering the quarry told Maltese the story of how this young horned dinosaur may have made its way to its final resting place. That resting place happened to be during a time and in a place that would go on to lithify into the Judith River Formation. The Judith River Formation preserves evidence of large freshwater deltas, lush forests, swamps, and even some marine environments. Mudstones and siltstones are found in the formation, and these are left in low elevation areas as they are the last product of the water cycle before everything empties into the ocean. Sandstones are also found here, and their grain size is just above the mud and silt, meaning there were some mid to mid-low elevation areas too. Coal beds evidence the presence of large amounts of forests. Bentonite is the sedimentary clay product of volcanic ash that gets weathered in the ocean. However, it can also occur in volcanic deposits when hot water gets into the ash and erodes the glass into clay particles. The last marine piece of the puzzle here is coquina, a sedimentary rock made up of a bunch of crunched up shells. These shells have to be cemented together with some other material, which can be just about any particles that are smaller than the shells. They can be found in marine and some freshwater areas, but mostly those with a lot of energy pushing things around. This level of force is needed to pick up all of those shells, break them up, round off the edges, and then quickly deposit them somewhere, and then continue doing that till you get a big layer of shells stuck together with nature's mortar. This is a good generalization of this huge layer of rock, but now that we have the setting, who inhabits it? The Judith River Formation was stuffed to the gills with ceratopsians. There are a ton of fragmentary, dubious, or uncertain ceratopsian fossils, which might make the picture even more diverse. But among the better fossils are Medusaceratops, Judiceratops, Mercuriceratops, Spiclipius, and Avaceratops. Fossil material is quite forthcoming in this layer of rock, allowing a greater window into the time and place than many other geologic formations. 5 genera of amphibians are known from the Judith River Formation, including the siren Hadrosaurus, the salamanders Lyserpiton, Opisthotriton, Prodesmodon, and Scapherpiton. Spear-snouted aspidoringiform fish swam with bowfins, gars, bonefish, sturgeons, and paddlefish, while stingrays sucked up tidbits from the river bottoms. The ultimate survivor, Champsosaurus, took the niche of the gharial, snapping up small slippery things with its fat head, palatal teeth, and long skinny snout. Crocodilians weren't missing here. In fact, one of the largest to ever live definitely snagged a Fricatoceratops or two in their time, the mighty gator Dinosuchus. The much smaller Brachychampsa and Lydiosuchus prowled the waterways as well. Swimming and scuttling with the crocs were the turtles Atticus and Basilames, both of which would have made great snacks for the big Archosaurian lugs. Scampering under the feet of the dinosaurs or snapping up their babies were a ton of lizards like whiptails, knob-scaled lizards, and the monitor or Gila-like Perissaniids, Paraderma, and Parasanawa. Aside from horned dinosaurs, the abundant herbivorous dinosaur guild included the hump-nosed Brachylophosaurus, Roman-crested Corythosaurus, and the boxy-headed Probrachylophosaurus. Ambling about, breaking knees, was the ankylosaurid Zool. Shouldering a lot of the predatory burden was the pineapple-like Edmontonia. Clacking skulls like a bunch of teenage football players were the pachycephalosaurid Hansusia. The biggest predators were the Tyrannosaurids Gorgosaurus and Daspletosaurus. Thanks to differences in their robustness, they may have preyed upon different animals, allowing the two to coexist without competition. The much smaller Maniraptoran, Sauronitholestes, and Dromaeosaurs were here too, mostly taking small prey like lizards, but probably capable of going after bigger things every now and then. Ostrich and paradinosaurs were likely here too, but their fossils are too fragmentary for any good analyses. Based on the faunal interchange between North America and Asia, I wouldn't be entirely surprised for Therizinosaurs to have had a presence here too. Pterosaurs, birds, and bugs were also definitely flying around, but evidence is lacking aside from some fossils of the penguin-like Hesperornis. The Judith River Formation is an enormous 360-meter thick unit of rock. That's so thick that scientists have had to divide it into members: the Parkman Sandstone, McClelland Ferry, Coal Ridge, and the Woodhawk members. Our Ceratops friend came out of the Upper Cretaceous aged Upper Coal Ridge member 76.3 to 75.3 million years ago. This makes it a much smaller window of time than the entirety of the Judith River Formation. This means that, though there was probably some overlap in animals between the layers, this isn't inherently the case. For example, the Ceratops layer specifically also had Cretaceous, Mercuriceratops, and Zool fossils. Since layers from before and after the time of the Coal Ridge member across North America seem to contain members of roughly the same animal groups, one could be safe in assuming they were probably here in the Coal Ridge member too, even without direct fossil evidence. And that, folks, is Ceratops. I and many people were aware of this animal for dang near the whole 20 years of its life before publication. Thanks to its unofficial lumping into the Avaceratops genus, it became the poster child for the old Ava, making it into the now long dead The Isle game, the hugely successful, highly articulated dinosaur toy line Beasts of the Mesozoic, and even Mattel's Jurassic World toy line. Though this one seems to hybridize traits from all the fossils ever referred to the Avaceratops genus. I wonder how many more dinosaurs or prehistoric animals are just sitting around waiting to be prepared and published like this one. What shall we see next? For more interesting stories about nature, the history of life, or what goes bump in the night, subscribe, like this video, drop a comment in the comment section below, and hit the bell icon to stay in the know with everything Edge. Thanks for watching.